In this video, we dive into 5 deadly bear encounters during hikes, from a solo trail runner's fatal mistake in the Canadian Rockies to a couple's invisible campsite error on the British Columbia coast. But first, we begin on a remote Alaskan salmon river, where we witness the last hike of the Tolversen family before they were eaten by grizzly bears. It was July 8, 2016. And the Sockeye Salmon Run was approaching its peak along a remote river system on the southern coast of Alaska. Tens of thousands of fish choked the shallow spawning channels, their dark red bodies visible from the air as they pushed upstream through water barely deep enough to cover their backs. The run drew dense concentrations of brown bears to the river corridor. The system was among the highest density coastal bear watersheds in the state, comparable to the major salmon rivers of the Katmai and Chignik regions, with wildlife officials estimating over 30 individual bears working a 12-mile stretch of river during the peak weeks. The bears maintained spacing through established hierarchies, dominant males claiming the most productive fishing sites, while subordinate animals, sows with cubs, and subadults worked the margins. Gareth Tolversen was a 44-year-old insurance adjuster from Boise, Idaho, who had planned the fishing trip as a family vacation. Tolversen was an enthusiastic recreational angler who had fished rivers across Idaho and Montana, but had never visited Alaska and had no experience in high-density bear country. He had organized the trip independently, booking a remote fly-in cabin through an online listing without arranging a local guide. His wife and their 2 teenage children accompanied him. The family had arrived at the riverside cabin 2 days earlier, and Tolversen had spent the first day fishing a section of river within sight of the structure. Bears were visible upstream and downstream, a sight the family found thrilling rather than alarming. Tolversen had not purchased bear spray, did not carry bear-resistant food containers, and had received no formal briefing on bear safety protocols. The cabin's owner had included a printed sheet of basic guidelines with the rental materials, but investigators later noted it had been found unopened among the family's belongings. On the morning of July 8th, Tolversen led his family approximately 1 mile downstream to a wide gravel bar where he had spotted a productive-looking pool the previous day. The gravel bar extended roughly 300 yards along the river, bordered on the inland side by dense willow thickets rising 6 to 8 feet high, and on the riverside by braided channels of shallow, cold glacial water. The bar was a natural travel corridor for bears moving between fishing sites, and fresh tracks were visible across the gravel. Tolversen set up the family's gear on the gravel bar and began fishing. Over the next 2 hours, he cleaned several sockeye on the gravel, leaving the gut piles and carcass waste on the rocks approximately 30 feet from where the family had spread their belongings. In established bear country, fish waste left on a gravel bar functions as a powerful attractant, drawing bears from considerable distances downwind. Grizzly bears along Alaskan salmon rivers are among the largest concentrations of brown bears on Earth, with dominant males in coastal populations commonly exceeding 800 pounds during the peak of the salmon run. While salmon abundance generally reduces competition-driven aggression, the sheer density of bears along productive rivers dramatically increases the probability of close-range encounters with humans. A bear approaching an undefended food source on a gravel bar will typically not retreat from shouting or arm-waving, particularly if it has learned through repeated experience that human presence near fish remains does not pose a genuine threat. At close range, a grizzly can cover 40 yards in less than 3 seconds. Without bear spray or other deterrents, a person caught in the open on a gravel bar has virtually no means of discouraging an approach or surviving an attack. Based on scene reconstruction by wildlife investigators, a large adult male approached along the gravel bar from downstream at approximately 11:15 a.m., drawn by the scent of the fish waste. Tolversen reportedly attempted to discourage the bear by shouting and waving, a response that might deter a wary bear, but that had no effect on this animal. The bear continued its approach without hesitation, closing the distance to Tolversen at the fish cleaning site. The attack was rapid, and Tolversen sustained fatal injuries on the gravel bar near the gut pile. The remaining family members fled in separate directions across the difficult terrain. Evidence recovered over the following 2 days, including track patterns, blood distribution, and the positions where each individual was found, allowed investigators to reconstruct a probable sequence of events. Evidence suggested that Tolversen's wife, running through the dense willow thickets along the inland edge of the gravel bar, rounded a bend in a narrow game trail and encountered a sow Grizzly with 2 cubs at close range. Track and physical evidence indicated a short, explosive defensive engagement consistent with a surprise encounter near cubs. The sow and cubs departed the area afterward. One of the 2 teenagers, disoriented and separated from the others by the braided river channels and dense willow, fled along the river's edge before emerging back onto the gravel bar. Evidence suggested the adult male had never fully left the fish waste area following the initial encounter and was still feeding when the teenager stumbled into close proximity. The bear's response was consistent with ongoing food defense behavior rather than a separate engagement. The 4th family member was found by investigators in a shallow braided channel approximately a quarter mile from the gravel bar. The cause of death was determined to be consistent with hypothermia and drowning. Investigators concluded that this individual, injured during the initial panic from a fall on the uneven river cobble, had collapsed in the cold glacial water and been unable to self-rescue. There was no evidence of bear contact. A separate fishing party camped approximately 2 miles upstream, heard distant sounds carried by the river valley, and activated a satellite phone to alert authorities. A recovery operation reached the gravel bar by helicopter later that afternoon. Investigators documented the scene over the following 2 days, noting the fish waste left on the gravel, the absence of bear spray or deterrents among the family's gear, and the unopened bear safety guidelines recovered from the cabin. The wildlife investigation concluded that a chain of compounding failures had produced the outcome: the absence of a local guide, the failure to carry or use bear deterrents, the improper disposal of fish waste on an active bear travel corridor, and the decision to establish a prolonged presence on a gravel bar during peak bear density had each individually increased risk. Together, they had dramatically increased the probability of a fatal encounter on a river where the margin for error was already razor-thin. While the Alaskan gravel bar had claimed an entire family through a chain of failures, no single member could have survived alone. The dense forests of northwestern Wyoming would soon reveal what happens when hikers walk into a predator's private territory without recognizing the warning signs. It was June 19, 2015, and the early summer sun filtered through a dense canopy of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir in a remote wilderness drainage in northwestern Wyoming. Snowmelt had only recently receded from the higher elevations, and the forest floor was thick with deadfall and new undergrowth that reduced ground-level visibility to less than 30 feet in most directions. Rowan Ketterick was a 28-year-old ranch hand from a small town in northwestern Wyoming, whose comfort in the backcountry had been built over a lifetime of hunting, fishing, and hiking the drainages and ridgelines surrounding his home. Ketterick and a close friend, also in his late 20s and from the same town, had set out that morning on an off-trail day hike into a steep drainage neither had explored before. The plan was to follow the creek upstream, loop over a low saddle, and return by early afternoon. Neither man carried bear spray. Among locals who had grown up in the area, this was a common and often unremarked omission, a familiarity with the landscape that bred a certain casualness about its risks. They carried water, sandwiches, and a single fixed blade knife. The drainage narrowed as they moved upstream, the timber thickening and the creek cutting deeper into the hillside. Approximately 2 miles from the trailhead, both men noticed a strong, unfamiliar odor in the still air. The smell was heavy, sweet, and sour at the same time. Neither recognized it as the scent of decomposing flesh. They continued upstream. Grizzly bears frequently cache large prey kills by partially burying the carcass under mounds of dirt, leaves, and forest debris, returning to feed over a period of several days. A bear defending a food cache is among the most dangerous encounter scenarios in grizzly country. The bear typically beds down within close proximity of the cache, often within 30 yards, and responds to any intrusion into the defended perimeter with an immediate, explosive charge. Unlike surprise encounters where bears may disengage once the threat is neutralized, cache defense attacks can involve repeated engagement if the bear perceives the threat has not fully retreated from the food source. Investigators who examined the scene the following day determined that the two men had walked directly into the defended perimeter of a partially buried elk carcass. The adult male grizzly that had claimed the kill was bedded approximately 25 yards from the cache, concealed by dense timber and deadfall. Based on evidence at the scene, the bear charged from concealment with no warning. Ketterick, in the lead, took the initial attack. His companion, several yards behind, attempted to retreat, but the dense timber and steep terrain limited his options. The bear's position between the companion and the only navigable route back downstream effectively cut off his escape. Evidence indicated that the companion moved back toward Ketterick's position, whether attempting to help or simply unable to find a clear path through the deadfall. In doing so, he re-entered the defended perimeter. The bear engaged a second time. Both men were found within 40 yards of the elk carcass. The bear was confirmed still present in the area, and wildlife officials closed the drainage. The investigation noted the absence of bear spray, the off-trail travel into dense timber, and the failure to recognize the odor of decomposition as contributing factors. Recovered evidence confirmed the bear had remained near the cache following the encounter, consistent with food defense behavior rather than predatory pursuit. While Wyoming's backcountry had proven lethal for two men who walked past every warning sign, the brushy switchback trails of western Montana would soon demonstrate how little time separates a routine hike from a fatal encounter. It was August 7, 2014, and the afternoon heat had settled into the narrow valleys of western Montana, where dense stands of alder and serviceberry choked the understory along a backcountry trail system bordering a federal wilderness area. The trailhead register showed moderate use, and a posted advisory warned of recent bear activity in the drainage, recommending travel in groups of 4 or more. Meredith Calhoun was a 37-year-old data analyst from Omaha, Nebraska, who had discovered long-distance hiking 5 years earlier and had since completed sections of 3 major western trails. She was fit, well-equipped, and methodical in her planning. Her gear included a canister of bear spray in a hip holster, a satellite messenger device, and a detailed topographic map of the route. What she lacked was experience in grizzly country. Her previous trail miles had been logged in areas where black bears were the primary concern, animals whose behavior and threat profile differed significantly from the grizzlies that occupied this drainage. Calhoun had planned a 3-day solo loop through the wilderness, entering from a western trailhead and exiting to the south. She signed the trailhead register at approximately 11:30 a.m. and proceeded alone, passing the bear advisory without adjusting her plans. The first several miles followed an open ridgeline with clear sight lines in every direction. The trail then descended into a drainage thick with alder, where the path narrowed to a single track cutting through head-high brush. Visibility on the tighter switchbacks dropped to less than 15 feet, with the dense vegetation forming walls on either side that eliminated any lateral escape route. Calhoun was not making consistent noise as she hiked, based on the absence of a bell or whistle among her recovered gear, and statements from 2 hikers who had passed her earlier on the ridge, noting she had been moving quietly. Adult female grizzly bears with cubs are responsible for the majority of defensive attacks on humans in North America. A cow grizzly with young will charge perceived threats with virtually no warning at distances under 50 feet, relying on explosive speed and overwhelming force to neutralize the danger before it can reach her cubs. These attacks are characteristically short, lasting between 1 and 3 minutes, and typically end once the perceived threat is motionless. The sow then retreats with her cubs. At distances under 20 feet, the speed of the charge leaves almost no time for a human to deploy bear spray or assume a defensive posture. Based on evidence recovered at the scene, investigators determined that Kaloun had rounded a blind switchback on the narrow trail and encountered a cow grizzly with 2 cubs at a distance of approximately 15 feet. At that range, in dense alder with no lateral escape, the encounter left virtually 0 reaction time for either party. The sow charged immediately. Kaloun's bear spray canister was found partially discharged several feet from her body, the safety clip removed, indicating she had attempted deployment. Investigators believe the charge began while she was still drawing the canister from its holster, and that the bear closed the remaining distance before the spray could be directed effectively. A partial discharge pattern on nearby alder branches, rather than in the line of the charge, suggested the canister was activated off-target during the impact. The injuries documented during recovery were consistent with a short, high-intensity defensive mauling, concentrated on the head, neck, and upper body. There was minimal post-mortem disturbance at the scene, consistent with a sow that disengaged once the threat was neutralized and departed with her cubs. Kaloun's satellite messenger had not been activated, suggesting the attack occurred too quickly for her to reach the device. When she failed to check in at her scheduled contact time that evening, her emergency contact notified authorities. A search team located her body the following afternoon, approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, on the descent into the drainage. The investigation concluded that solo travel against a posted group travel advisory, absence of noise-making in dense brush, and the blind geometry of the switchback had combined to produce a close-range encounter with no survivable margin. While Montana's brushy drainages had delivered a fatal lesson in the mathematics of distance and reaction time, the remote coastal trails of British Columbia would soon prove that even experienced hikers who follow every rule can still make one invisible mistake. It was September 22, 2017, and a cold Pacific fog hung over the river valleys of British Columbia's central coast, where old-growth forest met tidal flats along a remote multi-day hiking trail. The salmon runs were approaching their peak, drawing dense concentrations of grizzly bears to the rivers and streams that fed into the coastal estuaries. The trail was popular among experienced backpackers for its isolation and wildlife viewing opportunities, though its remoteness meant that emergency response times could exceed several hours. Stellan Uvrard was a 32-year-old freelance photographer from Vancouver whose work focused on wilderness landscapes and wildlife. He had hiked extensively across British Columbia's coast and was familiar with grizzly bear protocols. He and his partner, an experienced hiker in her late 20s, had planned a 5-day traverse of the coastal trail, timing their trip to coincide with the salmon run for photographic opportunities. Their preparation was thorough. Food was stored in a bear-resistant canister hung between trees at night. Cooking was conducted at least 100 yards from their sleeping area. The tent was clean, free of food odors, and equipped with a canister of bear spray stored in the vestibule pocket. They carried a satellite emergency beacon. On the 3rd evening, the couple selected a campsite in a meadow clearing approximately 200 yards from the trail. The site appeared ideal, a flat, grassy area with good drainage, sheltered from the coastal wind by a line of Sitka spruce. Running through the center of the meadow was a shallow, well-worn depression, approximately 2 feet wide, packed hard and free of vegetation. They noted it, but interpreted it as a general game trail, common throughout the coastal forest. They pitched their tent several feet from the depression and settled in for the night. The depression was an established bear travel corridor, a route used nightly by bears moving between the interior forest and the salmon streams along the coast. During salmon season, these corridors saw heavy, predictable traffic, particularly in the pre-dawn hours when bears moved toward the rivers ahead of first light. Grizzly bears traveling along established corridors move with purpose, following scent trails and well-worn paths that have been used by generations of bears. When a traveling bear encounters an unexpected obstacle on a familiar route at close range, particularly in low-light conditions, the response is often investigatory, involving sniffing, circling, and physical contact with the object. If the obstacle then produces sudden movement or sound at close range, during this investigation, the bear's response can escalate rapidly from curiosity to defensive aggression. The combination of close proximity, surprise, and an enclosed or obstructed space can produce violent outcomes even from bears that are not otherwise aggressive toward humans. Based on evidence at the scene, investigators determined that a large male grizzly traveling the corridor encountered the tent directly in its path during the pre-dawn hours. Track evidence indicated the bear had circled the tent at least once before making direct contact, pressing against the fabric and collapsing a section of the tent's rainfly. The satellite emergency beacon was activated at 4:17 a.m., providing investigators with a precise timestamp. Evidence suggested that Uvrard, positioned nearest the tent's vestibule, had unzipped the entrance and attempted to exit, placing himself at point-blank range with the bear. The bear's defensive reaction was immediate. The force of the initial contact collapsed the remaining tent structure onto his partner inside. She became entangled in the collapsed fabric, unable to orient, locate the canister, or reach the vestibule exit. The bear spray was found inside the collapsed tent with the safety clip still engaged. Evidence indicated the bear, still agitated by continued movement and sound from within the collapsed structure at its feet, engaged a second time through the fabric. A helicopter response team, dispatched after the beacon activation, reached the site approximately 3 hours later. Both Uvrard and his partner were found at the campsite. The investigation confirmed the tent had been pitched directly on a documented bear travel corridor and that the bear had encountered it as an unexpected obstacle during routine movement. Investigators noted that all other bear safety protocols had been followed correctly. The report concluded that the tent's placement on the corridor was the singular contributing factor, a mistake that was invisible to the hikers, but that placed them directly in the path of predictable bear traffic during peak activity hours. Hair samples recovered at the scene were used to identify the bear. Wildlife officials subsequently confirmed the animal had a documented history of investigating campsites, damaging unoccupied tents, and obtaining human food along the coastal trail in previous seasons. The bear had been involved in at least 2 prior food conditioning incidents reported to wildlife management, indicating a level of habituation to human camp structures and food association that likely contributed to the escalation from investigation to sustained contact. While the British Columbia coast had demonstrated how one unseen error could undo every other precaution, the high ridges of southern Alberta would soon prove that speed, fitness, and experience offer no protection when a grizzly appears at 15 feet with no warning. It was October 14, 2013, when the first hard frost of autumn settled across the eastern slopes of the Canadian Rockies in southern Alberta. The high country had already turned, aspens stripped bare and krumholtz dusted white at elevation, while the valleys below held the last warmth of a fading season. Berry crops across the region had produced poorly that year, and wildlife officials had noted increased bear movement through the fall as animals extended their foraging hours ahead of hibernation. Fen Braskow was a 44-year-old electrical contractor from Calgary who had built a quiet reputation among the city's competitive trail running community. A lean, disciplined athlete who logged over 60 miles a week across the foothills and mountain trails west of the city, Braskow preferred remote routes where he could run for hours without seeing another person. He had completed ultra-marathons across the Rockies and maintained a detailed digital log of every run, uploading route data from his GPS watch to an online training platform after each outing. Braskow's chosen route that morning was a 22-mile loop along a ridgeline trail in a remote section of the eastern slopes, accessible only through a forestry road that saw minimal traffic outside of hunting season. The trail alternated between open alpine meadows with clear sight lines and dense patches of krumholtz, the stunted, wind-battered subalpine trees that grew in impenetrable tangles along exposed ridges. Visibility in the krumholtz sections dropped to less than 15 feet, with the gnarled branches forming walls on either side of the narrow trail. Braskow departed the trailhead at approximately 6:45 a.m., his vehicle the only one in the small gravel pullout. He carried a hydration vest equipped with water, energy gels, and a canister of bear spray secured in the chest pocket. He was also wearing wireless earbuds, both recovered later at the scene, which eliminated his ability to hear approaching wildlife or to produce the kind of consistent noise that alerts bears to human presence. At running pace, he moved through the trail's blind sections quickly and almost silently. Grizzly bears are the most powerful terrestrial predator in North America, with adult males averaging between 400 and 600 pounds in the interior ranges and reaching weights above 800 pounds in coastal populations. Their muscular structure, reinforced by a distinctive shoulder hump of dense muscle, enables explosive acceleration over short distances with sprint speeds exceeding 35 miles per hour. A grizzly's claws can measure up to 4 inches, capable of inflicting devastating wounds with a single swipe, while their bite force exceeds 1,200 pounds per square inch. When surprised at close range, grizzly bears typically react with an immediate defensive charge. If the perceived threat turns and runs, the bear's instinctive pursuit response can override the initial defensive reaction, escalating a brief encounter into a sustained engagement over a short distance. Based on GPS data recovered from Braskow's watch, investigators determined that he had maintained a consistent pace of approximately 7 minutes per mile for the first 9 miles of the route. At mile 9.3, the data showed a sudden, dramatic deceleration followed by a complete stop. The location corresponded to a section of dense Krummholz, where the trail curved sharply between 2 walls of stunted spruce, with visibility estimated at less than 10 feet. Track evidence at the scene indicated that a grizzly had been moving along the trail in the opposite direction, and that both the bear and the runner had rounded the same blind curve at nearly the same moment. The encounter distance, reconstructed from disturbed ground and initial impact evidence, was estimated at under 15 feet. Evidence suggested Braskow had attempted to turn and run. Investigators recovered his earbuds on the trail approximately 12 feet from the point of encounter, consistent with being dislodged by sudden movement. His bear spray canister was found still sealed in the chest pocket of his hydration vest, which had been torn from his body. Track evidence indicated a short pursuit of approximately 40 yards before the bear overtook him. The injuries documented during recovery were consistent with a sustained close-range mauling. Search and rescue operations began the following morning after another trail user noted Braskow's vehicle had remained in the trailhead pullout overnight. Teams used his uploaded GPS route data to narrow the search area, locating the scene by early afternoon. The investigation concluded that Braskow had surprised a grizzly at extremely close range while running at speed through a low-visibility section of trail, that earbuds had prevented auditory awareness, and that his flight response had triggered a pursuit that escalated the encounter beyond the initial defensive reaction. Wildlife officials issued a trail closure for the area. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.